Thanks for joining us on a road trip through rabbinic narrative. No agenda, just clarity. I want to explore an astonishing Midrash that Rashi brings down at the beginning of Sefer Shmuel I. This is right after Chana makes her request of Hashem, becomes pregnant, gives birth to Shmuel, and then brings him to serve in the Mishkan. And then Perek Beis, what's famously known as Shiras Chana. In Pasuk Hey, halfway through, she says the following: akarah, yaldah, shivah, v'rabas banim umlala. A barren woman can end up giving birth to 7, and a woman with a lot of children could end up losing all of them. Rashi on the pasuk says that Chana is referring to herself, and that she ended up having 7 children. But the problem is that numerically it doesn't work out, because later in the parak it actually tells us that Chana had 5 children. So Rashi quotes the following Midrash, which says, Chana yoledes echad, Penina koveres shnayim. That when Chana gave birth to one child, Peninnah would end up burying 2 of her own. V'asara banim hayula, and Peninnah had 10 children. Yaldah Chana arba'a kavra Peninnah shmona. This would happen every time Chana had a child. So when Chana gave birth to 4 children, Peninnah ended up burying 8 of her own. Ukishinis abra v'yaldah vlad chamishi, when Chana became pregnant and ended up giving birth to her 5th child, so now Peninnah is really worried because she only has 2 children left, and according to the pattern that's been happening, these 2 children look like they're going to end up dying, and she's going to bury those 2 and be left with no children. So what does she do? Nishtatcha Peninnah leragleha ubiksho rachamim. So Peninnah begs Chana to daven for her so that her children don't die. Chana did so. V'chayu, those 2 children survived. V'nikru al shema. And those 2 children which survived end up being considered Chana's children. And that's how you get to 7. Chana had 5 of her own, and the remaining 2 children of Peninnah, who, according to this Midrash, only survived because of Chana's tefillah to Hashem, end up being considered Chana's children as well. And that's how you get to a total of 7. So I'd like to understand what this Midrash is really about. It's hard to know where to start because it's just so astonishing. The obvious injustice issue of Peninnah's children being killed every time Chana has a child is definitely hard to process. But I don't want to use that as a starting point, because I think that might end up distracting from what the Midrash is trying to do. I think the question that we need to start off with is, why is the Midrash so concerned about this numerical issue? Why do we have to get to the number 7? And the reason why that's such a pressing question is because when you look at the context of the pasuk, it's not even obvious that Chana is referring to herself. Actually, this whole parak of tefillah has very little to do with Chana personally, and is talking about more universal principles about the way Hashem runs the world. So if you look at the psukim, you'll start seeing right away that she's talking about how mighty people get broken down, weak people end up getting strengthened, people who are wealthy and have a lot to eat can end up losing it all, and those who are poor and hungry can end up getting their fortunes changing. She's talking about the midos of Hashem and how people's situations can change very quickly. And in the course of describing those situations, she also mentions how a barren woman can end up having many children, and someone with a lot of children can end up losing them. So it's not clear from psukim themselves that Chana is even talking about herself. She seems to just be talking about general patterns in Hashem's way of running the world. And in fact, most of the Mefarshim on the pasuk learn it that way, that she's not necessarily talking about herself. She's just talking about a general concept. For example, the Radak says, Umasha Amar Shiva, what she means by 7, Eino Dafka. It's not referring to specifically 7, Aval Hu Kach Cheshbon. So the Radak says that Sheva is just an expression of many, and you can find that throughout Tanakh, where Sheva refers to many. So it's not even 7 in specific. She's just saying that someone who is barren can end up having many children. So it's also interesting that Rashi brings down other opinions in that Midrash about how to get to the number 7 by Chana. They're still reading this pasuk as referring to Chana, but they get to the number 7 differently. So the narrative of Chana versus Penina is Divrei Rabbi Nechemia. But Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, he says, B'nei banim harei hein kibanim, that grandchildren are considered like children. And so Shmuel had 2 children, so those 2 are considered like Chanas, and that's how you get to 7. And then there's another opinion, V'yesh omrim shivah b'gematria kiminyan Shmuel. I found this to be really cute, which is that the gematria of shivah is 377, which is also the gematria of the name Shmuel. And so it's referring to Shmuel. And that's what she means by shivah. So I think what's clear from this particular Midrash is that not only are they trying to say that Chana is describing her own situation, but they really want to work out how it is that Chana gets to 7 children without actually having 7 children. If it were me, I would just say, listen, I don't need to be forced into this. Chana is not necessarily even talking about herself, so I don't need to work this out. But the Midrash is very interested in working this out. And so the question is why? What is the Midrash trying to get at? There are a couple of facts about this Midrash that already lead me not to get wrapped up in whether or not this actually happened and start asking questions based on that. First of all, this is such an astonishing story. I'm surprised that it's not in the psukim themselves. The fact that Peninnah has 10 children is not mentioned in the psukim either. It's just an inference from something that Elkanah says to Chana when he says, Halo anochi tov lach me'asara banim. And so, to me, the historical account is not really what I want to focus on. But it's the last part that struck me as the most interesting, which is that once those 2 children survive, v'nikru al shema, they were considered to be Chana's children. How exactly does that work? And so I think what this is portraying is a reframing for us what Chana herself was looking for the whole time in this story of the birth of Shmuel. What I mean by that is you can read this story of Chana and her request of Hashem and then her giving Shmuel back to Hashem as a woman who really wants to be a biological mother. And she makes a very sincere, genuine request of Hashem. And part of that request is her neder to dedicate Shmuel to his service. And that's what happened. It can be read that way on one level. But I think what Chazal are introducing now is a different way to read this. They seem to be extending the idea of motherhood from something biological to something more expansive. Now, Chana's motherhood is extending beyond the children that she births. It's even extending to Peninnah's children, v'nikru al shema. The fact that Chana davened so that Peninnah's 2 children can survive extends these 2 children that she didn't even give birth to. And if you look at the next opinion, which is B'nei banim kibanim, that grandchildren are like children, it's doing something similar. Grandchildren are not your children. They are your offspring, but they're not your children. I think what that's showing you is that in the Masorah community, in the covenantal community, parenthood is not strictly biological, but it can take on different forms. It can extend educationally through the teaching of Torah. It can extend relationally through helping and aiding the survival of someone else's children and making sure that they can stay attached to the Masorah community, such as Chana did in her tefillah with Peninnah. And I think what it's doing is it's saying, don't just look at Chana's motivation simply in the biological framework, but there's something even deeper that Chana is longing for when she makes the request of Hashem for a child. And that's that she wants to be a mother that contributes to the community of Klal Yisrael in general. And I think that's a much deeper reading than simply one of a woman who desires to be a mother and birth a child. And I don't think it's accidental that Chazal frame Chana's relationship to Peninnah's remaining children through the act of tefillah. Chana's whole story centers around tefillah. In fact, in the Gemara, her tefillah becomes the model of the proper way to daven before Hashem. And so what you have here is an interesting reversal, which is that in the Psukim, her tefillah is centered and focused on her having a biological child. And in the Midrash, her tefillah is now addressed to the survival of Peninnah's children. In the actual Psukim, Peninnah's motherhood intensifies Chana's lack of motherhood. In the Midrash, Chana's motherhood is now what enables Peninnah's motherhood to be sustained through her tefillah. And it makes me wonder if Chazal got this idea from the very shira itself. We mentioned that really Chana's shira expresses more universal concepts. The shira itself shows you that Chana doesn't just leave her experience as something purely personal. She experiences something very personal with Hashem, but when she expresses what she learns from it and how she views it, she expresses it with universal language. She talks about the akarah, talks about the one with many children. She talks about the hungry, the wealthy, the strong, the weak. Personal experience becomes a way for her to understand and appreciate how Hashem interacts with other people as well, and how other people's situations can also change in a moment with the chesed of Hashem. And I think the Midrash is taking that idea and just expressing it in a concrete form through the relationship between Chana and Peninnah. The tefillah that originally allows Chana to become a mother now becomes a tefillah on behalf of someone else's motherhood. And not just anyone else's, but Peninnah's. And that's an amazing reversal. Chana's able to take responsibility through her tefillah for Peninnah's children. And they're nikru al shema, not because they're her biological children, because they're not, but because Chazal are showing us that Chana's motherhood ultimately expresses itself in her ability to participate in the survival and the future of someone else's children as well. And so that's why this numerical problem matters. Chazal start by asking, how did Chana have 7 children? But I think they're really asking a deeper question, which is, what does it actually mean to be one of Chana's children? Thanks so much for joining us. In our next episode, we're going to try and understand why Chazal claim that at the end of 40 years in the desert, right before entering Eretz Canaan, Moshe is discussing laundry with Bnei Israel. How is that relevant? See you on the next road trip.